The knock came at 2 in the morning. Not a careful knock, not the knock of a person who isn't sure they should be here. The knock of a man who has been riding through -27 degrees for 20 minutes and has used up all the hesitation on the way. Eleanor Wade was off the platform before she was fully awake. She pushed through the inner curtain and the outer and threw back the canvas, and the cold hit her face like a flat hand. Caleb Cross, frost coating the shoulders of his coat, ice at the edges of his hat brim, his horse behind him with her head down, steam pouring off her into the lamplight. Nothing in his face but the look of a man who has burned through every feeling except the one that will not wait. "Ruth," he said. Temperature of 103, going up. Nell was already reaching for her coat. "She's been calling for an hour." He stopped. He looked at the ground for a moment, the way a man looks when the words cost him something. Then he looked back at her. "She keeps asking for you." Not for the doctor, not for the reverend, not for any of the 20 people who had sat in the church hall 2 weeks ago and listened to Dorothea Hensley suggest that Eleanor Wade ought to be sent to a facility in Cheyenne for the good of her own health. For her, the woman with the cave, the woman nobody believed, she said, "Let me get my bag. If you have ever known something was right before a single person around you was willing to believe it, stay with this story until the very end." Because what happened to Eleanor Wade that winter in Pine Hollow is not a story about a cave. It is a story about a woman who kept working when every voice in the valley told her to stop. Subscribe if you haven't already. Drop your city in the comments below. Now let's go back to where this all began. James Wade died on a Tuesday in February. He died in the cabin they had built together in the first year of their marriage, in the bed where they had slept through 3 Wyoming winters. And Eleanor was holding his hand when it happened. He had been sick since December. A lung fever, that was what the doctor called it, on the 2 occasions he made the ride out. What Nell had learned in 6 weeks of sitting beside James was something the doctor hadn't mentioned. The cabin was making it worse. Cold came up from the floor. Moisture gathered on the inner surface of the log walls and ran in thin channels down to the dirt beneath, and the room smelled of it, of damp wood, of cold that would not leave no matter how much heat you threw at it. She tried everything she knew to try. She kept the stove burning through the night. She hung extra blankets against the north wall. She moved his bed as close to the fire as she dared. The room near the stove grew hot enough to sweat in. 3 feet away you could see your own breath. The warmth never reached where it needed to go, and the wet rattle in his chest went on deepening. And there came a morning in February when she understood it was not going to stop. He died at 6:19. The watch had been on the shelf beside the bed. James had wound it every morning at 6 o'clock without fail, a habit from some earlier part of his life that he'd never explained and she had never needed to ask about. He was too weak to reach it on his last morning. She wound it for him. He watched her do it. Sometime in the next hour he was gone, and when she picked up the watch afterward, it had stopped at 6:03. She wound it the next morning. She wound it the morning after that. It took her a while to understand why she kept doing it. Kept standing at the shelf each morning and turning the crown and listening for the small sound of the mechanism catching, like a breath taken just before speaking. She wound it because the sound was his, because it said, "The day has begun," because some mornings that was the only thing in the world she was certain of. She was 28 years old. She had 80 acres on the eastern edge of Pine Hollow, a note to the land office coming due in April, and a cabin she could not sleep in without hearing him cough. She was not a woman who let grief sit for long before she set it somewhere useful and got on with the work. Her father had raised her that way. Wallace Pritchard had kept sheep in northern Vermont for 30 years, and he was not a sentimental man. What he was careful. What he passed to his daughter was not comfort but attention, the habit of watching closely before deciding. The winter she turned 6, a neighbor's cattle herd died in a 3-day storm that left her father's sheep untouched. The neighbor came by afterward, hat in hand, to ask how. Her father took him out to the fold and pointed at things that didn't look like much. A double layer of raw wool packed between the inner and outer walls of the shelter. Flat stones set into the floor that spent all day absorbing what warmth there was and gave it back through the night. A low entrance that broke the force of the wind before it could enter. Small decisions made before the cold arrived. The cold does not ask who was right, her father said. He was looking at the sheep, not at the neighbor. It only asks who was ready. She had not fully understood what he meant until the winter James died. She spent the summer of 1888 thinking. She walked the 80 acres. She read what she could find at the lending shelf in the trading post. She thought about her father's sheep, about raw wool, the kind not yet cleaned, still heavy with lanolin, the kind that sheds water the way a duck sheds it, the kind that stays warm even soaking wet. She had seen her father tested against wool that had been washed clean, and the difference was not small. She thought about stone and the particular patience of stone, the way it takes heat in slowly and gives it back the same way, long after any fire has gone cold. She was checking the east fence line on a Thursday afternoon in late August when the storm came in fast from the north. She barely made it to a shallow rock recess in the hillside, not a true cave, just an indent, maybe 6 feet deep. Before the rain turned to something colder, she stayed 90 minutes, she counted. Outside, the temperature dropped hard. She could see frost beginning to lace the rocks at the entrance. Inside the recess, the air was cold, but it was not changing the way the air outside was changing. She pressed her hand flat against the back wall. The stone was cold, yes, but differently cold. Not the sharp, moving cold of the wind. Something slower. Something that had been sitting at the same temperature for a long time waiting. She walked home that evening and stood for a while in the cabin doorway, looking at the walls. Then she turned around and climbed back up the slope in the last of the light. She found the real cave 200 yards farther east, 12 feet deep, 8 feet wide. Solid sandstone overhead. She left a thermometer inside and went home. She came back in the morning, outside 41 degrees, inside the cave 48. She came back before dawn 2 days later, outside 34, inside 46. The cave was not making heat. It was refusing to lose it. By the first day of September, she knew what she was going to do. By the 10th, she knew what people were going to say. She gave herself 3 more weeks to be certain. Then she began carrying things up the slope. The first load was 2 rolls of raw wool, still greasy with lanolin, borrowed against next spring's clip. The second morning, she took the neighbor's mule and hauled dry piñon and juniper she'd cut and stacked back in July. By the first week of October, she was making 2 trips a day, and the whole of Pine Hollow could see her going up and down that slope, and the whole of Pine Hollow had something to say about it. She had expected that. Reverend Aldous Price came on a Wednesday. He was a decent man. She had always found him decent, and he stood at the base of the slope with his hat in his hands. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "stone holds cold. Every miner in this territory will tell you the same. You get yourself inside that rock when the deep cold arrives, and it will work against you, not for you. You'll freeze faster in there than you would standing in the open." "I appreciate your concern, Reverend," Nell said. "Truly." She picked up the next stone. He waited a moment. He left. Silas Ford, the blacksmith, came on Friday. Silas knew metal and fire and the movement of heat the way she knew wool and stone, and she respected him for it. He planted himself at the entrance frame she'd been building and crossed his arms. You want to know what happens, he said. You run a stovepipe inside a sealed rock space, the gases build up, and you go to sleep and you don't wake up. That isn't my opinion. That is what happens. I'll keep that in mind, she said. He looked at her for a moment. She could see he knew she wasn't going to stop. Well, he said, you'll be explaining yourself to your maker, not me, and he walked away. She was already thinking about the stovepipe, had been for 3 weeks. She had a plan for it. There was no point in saying so. She did not explain. She worked. Dorothea Hensley came on Saturday, riding out slowly from the road with the careful, sorrowful expression of a woman who has made up her mind long before arriving, but means to appear thoughtful. Eleanor, she said, in the voice she used at the women's church meetings, warm, measured, weighted with concern. I say this only because I care about you. A woman alone in your circumstances, sleeping in a hole in the hillside. People will have questions. The land office will have questions. About your fitness to maintain the claim. Nell stopped. She looked at Dorothea for a long moment. Dorothea looked back with patient sympathy. Thank you, Dorothea, Nell said. I'll think about that. She turned back to the entrance frame. After a while, Dorothea rode back down to the road. Cora Phelps was the last of them. Cora was not cruel. She was practical in the way that small communities are practical, measuring everything against reputation. Even if it works, Cora said, and I'm not saying it won't, who is going to buy your wool in the spring? Who does business with the woman who spent all winter in a cave? Anyone who wants good wool, Nell said, and anyone who wants to know how to stay warm. Cora studied her for a moment, trying to decide if this was foolishness or something else. She seemed to conclude it was too early to say. She walked back down to the road without another word. 4 people, 4 different arguments. Nell heard every one of them and answered each the same way, with thanks, with silence, with the next thing that needed doing. She did not explain, she worked. It was the Tuesday of the 2nd week when Caleb Cross rode the upper fence line above the cave. She knew him the way you know most people in a valley this size, by sight, by name, by what people said when his name came up. Cedar Ridge, 600 acres on the north end of Pine Hollow. He had been running it alone for 3 years, since Margaret died, and nobody in Pine Hollow ever talked about that directly, but everyone said things around it. She had spoken maybe 10 words to the man in her life. She was halfway up the slope with a second wool roll, the mule pulling badly on the lead and the roll wanting to slide off the pack, and she was losing the argument with it when she heard hooves stop above her. She did not look up. She heard him dismount, the creak and settle of leather. And then he was beside her, and he took the wool roll up in both arms, not making anything of the weight. And he carried it to the cave mouth and set it down with the others. He stood there for a moment, looking at the entrance frame she'd built, the offset opening, the canvas stretched across the outer vestibule. Your north fence post is loose, he said, corner of the lower pasture. I know, she said, I'll get to it. He nodded once. He walked back to his horse. He mounted and rode on. She stood looking at the wool he'd set down. She turned the moment over, a man who helped without being asked and said nothing about why. She kept turning it. She couldn't find the bottom of it. She picked up her hammer and went back to work. The next morning she was fitting wool panels inside the vestibule when she heard small boots on the loose stones outside. She looked up. A boy. Dark-haired, about 8 years old, with a careful face, and both hands shoved in his coat pockets, studying the entrance the way a person studies something they've been thinking about on the walk over. What are you building? He said. A shelter, she said. He walked around the outside of the entrance, examining the corners. He stepped inside the vestibule and stood in it for a moment, then looked back out through the opening at the slope behind him, the way you look when you're checking whether a thing feels different from the inside. "It's warmer in here," he said. "That's the idea." He came out and stood beside her. "What do you want me to carry?" "Who are you?" she said. "Thomas Cross. My father's ranch is up the north slope." She looked at him for a moment. Then she pointed to the pile of flat stones she'd gathered from the hillside above. "Those go to the far wall," she said. He picked up the first one. He carried it through the entrance. He came back for the next one. He didn't say anything more, and neither did she. One stone, then the next. By the time the afternoon light began to stretch long across the slope, he had moved every stone in the pile. He stood at the entrance and looked in at the far wall where the stones sat in their rough row, and he assessed the work the way his father assessed a fence line, looking for the gap, the weak point, the thing that would give first. "The bottom ones are the most important," he said. "You want them flat." "I do," she said. "I can get flatter ones. There are good flat ones down by the creek." She looked at him. He was not offering. He was simply noting a fact about the world and leaving the decision to her. "Tomorrow," she said, "if you want to." He nodded once. He looked at the cave entrance again. Then he looked at the valley below, where the first lamps were beginning to come up in the windows of the houses. "My father says you know what you're doing," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "He said that?" Thomas looked at her steadily. "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." She turned back to the entrance frame. The light was going. She had 2 more lashings to tighten before dark. "You'd better get home," she said. He went without arguing, down the slope in the long last light, and she watched him go the way you watch something that has surprised you, with the particular attention you give to things you hadn't known you needed. One stone. Then the next. The afternoon went. The light went with it. Down in the valley below, 7 chimneys were already putting out their evening smoke, thin gray columns rising straight in the dead-still air. From up here, from the height of the slope, they looked almost small enough to blow out with a breath. Nell watched them for a moment. She picked up her hammer. She went back inside. Thomas came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Within 2 weeks, he had made himself a regular fixture on the slope, showing up before Nell had finished her first cup, wearing the same coat and the same expression of careful, preloaded questions he'd been working through on the walk over. He was good company of a particular kind, the kind that didn't feel the need to fill every silence with something. He carried stones when she asked and held off when she didn't, and when he had something to say, he waited for a pause in the work to say it. "Why doesn't the cold follow you in?" he asked one afternoon. He was standing in the vestibule with one hand pressed to the inner curtain, feeling the difference in temperature between his side and the air pocket behind the wool. "Most people think cold gets in," Nell said. She was fitting a length of leather strip along the base of the outer curtain, sealing the gap where canvas met stone. "It doesn't. What goes out is heat. You hold the heat and the cold has nowhere to come from." Thomas stood very still, turning this over. "My father says the same thing about trouble," he said finally. "Not heat. Trouble. He says trouble doesn't get in, people let it out." Nell looked up at him. "Your father sounds like he thinks before he talks." "Most of the time," Thomas said. "Sometimes he just doesn't talk at all." He went back to carrying stones. The first real failures arrived in the second week of November, and Nell was glad she found them early. The bottom of the outer curtain had frozen solid to the stone floor, moisture from boots and melting snow gathering in the wool fibers overnight and icing by morning. A small problem on its face, a dangerous one underneath. A door that froze shut was a door that might not open in the moment it most needed to. She took the curtain down and trimmed 3 inches from the bottom. She fitted a raised wooden threshold across the entrance and ran a leather strip along the lower edge so the curtain sealed without touching stone. She tested it for 4 nights before she trusted it. The second problem was behind the stove. She'd placed it deep inside, away from the entrance the way she'd planned. But the first hard freeze showed her a thin film of moisture on the rock directly behind the firebox. Warm air pressing against cold stone and condensing there in the night. Left alone, that moisture would work into the bedding and rust the stove fittings, and eventually grow things in the dark that had no business growing where a person slept. She shifted the stove 7 inches from the wall. She stacked loose granite behind it, not flush against the stone, but gapped at the base so air could rise behind the heated rock instead of collecting in a trapped pocket. The next morning the wall was dry, one stone, then the next. She kept a ledger on the wood rack, date, outside temperature, inside temperature, hours of fire, wood used. The numbers told a story she could measure. Most mornings she preferred those to the other kind. Thomas noticed she was running out of pages before she did. He showed up the next morning with a new ledger purchased with his own coins. He set it on the rack without remark, the way his father had set the wool roll at the cave mouth. And Nell noticed the similarity and said nothing about it, and that suited them both. He brought Ruth in the 3rd week of November. She appeared at the entrance in a coat that had been cut down from a grown man's wool coat and still overwhelmed her, fine blonde hair escaping in every direction from a knit cap that had slipped sideways. She looked at the entrance, the canvas, the vestibule opening, with the complete and undisguised attention of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned that staring at things is impolite. "You can come in," Nell said. Ruth walked through the outer opening and into the vestibule and stopped. She held both hands out flat in front of her, palms up, the way a person tests a fire to feel how real it is. "It's warm in here," she said. "That's what it's supposed to do." Ruth turned in a slow half-circle, taking in the stove with its banked coals, the layered wool on the sleeping platform, the old red-striped blanket folded at the foot of the bed. She considered it all with the solemnity of a judge. "Like bread," she said. "Exactly like bread," Nell said. She didn't know quite how to explain after why that comparison steadied her the way it did. Something about it, the warmth of it, the plainness of it, the fact that a 4-year-old had found in 30 seconds what she had been trying to build all autumn, sat in her chest and stayed there. If you're still here, watching this far in, you already know what kind of woman Eleanor Wade was. Leave a comment and tell me, what would you have done in her place? And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. These stories come out every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next. The first morning, Caleb Cross appeared with coffee. She assumed it was a coincidence. He was there at 5:45 before full light, with 2 tin cups and a small pot, and he said only "still hot" and handed her one. She took it. They stood at the cave mouth and watched the first gray light come down the pines into the valley below. It was cold enough to see their breath. Neither said much. He was there the next morning and the morning after. He never explained the habit. He simply kept it, the way he had lifted the wool roll, without ceremony, without inviting thanks, as though it were something he'd been doing for years, and she had simply arrived in time to be part of it. Those mornings had their own grammar. He arrived before full light. She had the stove already running. He set the pot on the flat stone near the entrance and poured without asking, and they stood at the cave mouth with their cups and watched whatever the morning was doing in the valley. Fog lying low along the creek, or frost catching the first angled light, or simply the slow arrival of gray into dark that passes for dawn in November. He did not fill the silences. She had known men who couldn't stand a silence, who talked at it, who explained things unnecessarily, who offered opinions on matters that needed no opinion. Caleb Cross was not one of them. He drank his coffee. He looked at the valley. If something worth saying came along, he said it. If nothing did, he was content to stand. It was not nothing standing there. She understood that now. It was a choice made again each morning to come up the slope before the day demanded anything of either of them, and simply be present without requiring anything in return. That was not a small thing to offer a person who had been living alone for 8 months. She did it first thing, the way she always did, before coffee, before the stove, before anything, and when she looked up, he was watching her hands. He looked away. "My husband wounded every morning," she said. "At 6 o'clock. Yes," he said, one word, not crowded into it, not backed away from it, just present. She put the watch away. He refilled her cup from the pot. They stood until the light was full on the ridge line, and then he walked back down to his horse and she went inside, and that was all. That was enough. She was beginning to understand a few things about Caleb Cross. Not everything. Enough. Marta came on a Thursday in the last week of November, carrying a bundle of batting he had sent over. She set it down. She looked at the cave the way a practical woman looks at something she has already decided she was wrong about. Attentive, a little quiet. "He checks the ledger reading every night," she said. "Did you know that?" "I didn't," Nell said. "Every night since you started keeping it." Marta sat on the flat stone near the entrance. She folded her hands. "I've worked for Caleb Cross 11 years. You want to know something about him?" Nell set down her hammer. "Margaret passed on a Sunday," Marta said. "She'd been sick 4 days. The baby was 4 days old, never got a name." She said it without softening it, the way a person reports something they have had to learn to carry plainly. Caleb sat by that bed all Sunday night. Monday morning, before anyone in the house was awake, he went out to the east pasture and he drove fence posts. 40 posts, 3 days, alone in ground that was half frozen through. He worked until his hands bled, then he kept working. She looked at the entrance frame, the curtain, the drainage groove. "He never cried," she said, "not where any person could see. He just built until there wasn't any fence left to build." Nell sat down on the step of the entrance frame. "When he lifted the wool roll," she said slowly. "That first morning, he saw someone doing the only thing left that made sense," Marta said. "He recognized it. They sat without speaking for a while. The stove made its small, even sounds. He said something at the trading post last week," Marta said. "Dorothea Hensley was speaking near him about the doctor. About your state of mind." She paused. "He set down his cup," he said, "in a room with 8 other men listening. Mrs. Hensley. That woman is not out of her mind. She is out of patience with people who don't know the difference." Then he picked his cup back up. Nell was quiet. She did not look for him on the slope that afternoon. She did not go to the trading post to thank him. She did not say anything about it the next morning when he brought the coffee. And they stood in the usual silence, watching the valley come into light. She did not explain. She worked. The notice came on a Wednesday, just after noon. A man from the land office rode out, dismounted at the base of the slope, and called up in the measured voice of a person delivering something they have been instructed to deliver and would rather not. She climbed down. She took the papers. She read them standing there in the cold while his horse shifted its weight behind him. The words were formal and precise, and they meant one thing. The county land agent, Dorothea Hensley's husband, had filed a challenge against her homestead claim, irregular habitation. A woman maintaining a claim while residing in an unregistered structure did not satisfy the terms of the original land grant. The claim was under formal review. He asked if she had questions. "No," she said, "thank you." She walked back up the slope. She went inside. She stood at the shelf where the watch sat, and she read the notice a second time. She set it on the shelf beside the watch. She picked up her hammer, one stone, then the next. The church harvest gathering was held on the 3rd Saturday of November, as it was every year, in the main hall behind the chapel, with long tables and candles, and the particular warmth of a room full of people who have known each other too long to pretend they aren't watching everything. Nell went. She went because not going would have said something she didn't mean, and because Thomas and Ruth had been counting on it since the week before. Caleb was still on the range. A fence line emergency in the upper pasture had kept him out since morning, and so she walked into the hall with Thomas on one side and Ruth on the other, and she took her place at the table with the other women, and she helped serve, and she listened to the room move around her. She had known it was coming. Not the evening, not the specific moment, not the exact words, but the shape of it. Dorothea Hensley had been building towards something for weeks, and a room full of witnesses was always where that kind of thing arrived. Dorothea rose just before the blessing. She did it gently, that was the thing. She rose the way a woman rises at a church table when she has something sorrowful to share. Slowly, with her hands folded in front of her, and a softness in her face that looked so much like compassion, it was almost impossible to tell it from the real thing. "Before we ask the blessing," she said, and her voice was warm, pitched perfectly for the room, "I want to ask everyone to hold Eleanor Wade in their prayers this season." The room stilled. We've all been watching, and we've all been worried. Her eyes moved to Nell, not sharply, not triumphantly, just sorrowfully, the way you look at something you would help if only help were possible. A woman alone, a year out from losing her husband, choosing to sleep in a cave on the mountainside, Doctor. Marsh and I have spoken, and there are facilities in Cheyenne that provide proper rest and care for women who have suffered the kind of losses Eleanor has. Good places. Kind places. She paused. It might be the most loving thing we can do for her. The room did not laugh. 20 faces turned toward Nell, and what was on them was worse than laughter. It was tender, helpless sympathy, the look of people who have already decided what they are seeing and are sorry about it. Nell looked at her plate. She looked at Thomas beside her, his jaw tight, his hands very still on the table, fighting something down the way his father had taught him, or perhaps had simply shown him without meaning to. She looked at Ruth, who was too young to understand what had been said, but understood something had happened, because she had put her small hand on top of Nell's without a word. Nell set down her serving fork. She said, "Thank you, Dorothea, that's very kind." She looked at Thomas. "Come on, you two." She did not rush. She stood the way a person stands when they have decided something, not when something has been done to them. She folded her napkin. She pushed her chair back. She walked to the door at the pace of someone who has nowhere to be but where they choose. Outside, the night was clear and very cold. Thomas walked beside her and said nothing, which was the right thing, and Ruth walked on her other side with her small hand still inside Nell's. At the base of the east slope, she stopped. "Go home," she said. "Your father will be back by dark. We can come up," Thomas said. "No." She kept her voice plain. "Go home, Thomas." He looked at her for a long moment with those careful eyes that had been watching the world a while. He took Ruth's hand. He went. Nell went up the slope alone in the cold. Inside the cave, she did not light the lamp. She sat on the sleeping platform in the dark and let the warmth of the stones settle around her the way it always did, slowly, evenly, without drama. The stove had been banked before she left. The temperature had not changed much. It never changed much in here. That was the whole point. She thought about the look on the faces in that hall, not the cruelty. Dorothea's particular cruelty was not the kind that shouted or sneered. It was the kind that organized, that arranged things carefully, and then stood back, hands clean. What she thought about instead was the other faces, the ones that had turned to her with genuine sympathy, with real concern, with the particular look of people who have already made up their minds what they are seeing and are sorry about it. That was the part that stayed with her. The people who weren't trying to hurt her had hurt her anyway, because they trusted Dorothea's account of the world over their own observation. She had worked on that slope for 2 months. They had seen her go up and come down. They had seen Thomas following her up each morning, and Ruth sitting in the vestibule. They had seen the wood stacked on the rack and the stovepipe rising cleanly from the rock above. And still, Dorothea's voice in a warm room had undone all of it in 30 seconds. She reached for the watch, 6:03. The hands had not moved in 9 months, and they would not move tonight. She held it in both hands in the dark and looked at the stopped face and thought about James. Not the way she usually let herself think about him, carefully in small pieces, but all at once, the full weight of it, the particular sound of his breathing when he slept, and the way he always left the coffee pot too close to the edge of the stove. The way he said her name, not Eleanor, not Nell, just a small sound at the back of the throat that belonged only to him. She thought about the facilities in Cheyenne. She thought about the notice on the shelf beside her. She looked at the vestibule she had built. The raised threshold, the leather strip, the double curtain, the offset entrance that turned the wind before it could enter. The wood rack, dry and full. The drainage groove cut into the stone floor. One decision, then the next. One stone, then the next. All of it done, all of it tested, all of it standing. She set the watch back on the shelf. She picked up her hammer and drove a nail that had been working loose from the platform frame. She set the hammer down. She built up the fire. She lay on top of the blankets in her coat and boots and looked at the ceiling until sleep found her. She did not explain. She stayed. November 18th, 1888, the air above Pine Hollow Basin stopped moving. It was the kind of stillness that had a name in the territory. Old-timers called it the held breath, the pause before the chest fully empties. The light went flat and yellow-gray. Chimney smoke rose straight up and then simply stopped as though the sky had sealed. The birds were gone from the pines before most people were out of their beds. Silas Ford's hammer went quiet at noon. He had spent the morning watching the clouds build from the north and doing a private accounting of his wood supply that he didn't much like the outcome of. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped 11 degrees and was still dropping. By dark, it was at 0. By midnight, it was below and still moving. The cold came in like something that had been planning this. Inside the cave, Nell added 3 pieces of juniper to the stove and watched the temperature on the ledger thermometer, 49 degrees. Outside, -12 and the wind beginning at last, finding every gap it could, pressing against the canvas on the vestibule, testing the curtain seam, looking for the way in. It did not find one. She slept. She woke before 6. Outside, -19. Inside, 46. She wound the watch. She started the coffee. Down in the basin below, the morning was a different story. Cora Phelps discovered her water barrel had frozen solid at some point in the night. Not at the top, not with a skin of ice, but all the way through a solid pale column that wouldn't yield to a fire set beside it for 2 hours. Her children were cold. Her wood pile, stacked against the north exterior wall the way every family in Pine Hollow stacked their wood, had taken on moisture from the last week's wet snow and was burning badly. Thick smoke, low heat, twice as much wood for half as much warmth. Across the basin, the Aldous household had a pipe freeze at the kitchen joint that took the better part of the morning to thaw. 2 other families found their stored root vegetables had frozen through in their cellars. They had been kept close to the exterior walls for convenience, and now they were ruined. A man on the southern edge of Pine Hollow woke to find the puddle of water he'd left in a bucket by the back door had frozen a full inch deep. He stood looking at it in his coat and boots at 7 in the morning and thought about the woman on the mountain with the cave that nobody had believed. in, and he was not the only one thinking something like that before noon arrived. The cold had not asked permission. It had simply come the way it always did, and it had found every weakness that convenience or habit or the wrong kind of certainty had left open. Wood stacked against exterior walls, water stored where wind could reach it, heat thrown at problems from the outside when the problems lived in the structure itself. Cora came up the slope at 10 o'clock with her youngest on her hip and her jaw set, and her eyes not quite able to stay on Nell's face. Nell did not say anything about having been right. She filled a jug with water from the covered basin. She carried 3 days of dry wood down from the raised rack and stacked it on Cora's sled. She said, "Come back if you need more," Cora said. "Thank you," she said it low, looking at the ground. It was not a small thing, Nell knew. She let it be the size it was. Silas Ford came the following afternoon. His covered pile had caught wind-driven snow on the western edge, and the outer logs had soaked through without him noticing until he split into them. He stood at the cave entrance with the particular stiffness of a man who has spent 2 months being certain about something, and is now being certain about something else. "I need dry wood," he said. "Raised racks in the back," Nell said. "Take what you need." He went in and loaded his arms. On the way out, he stopped at the entrance and looked at the vestibule, the double curtain, the offset opening, the gap that forced the wind sideways before it could travel. "You'll want to lift the stack next time," she said. 14 inches off the ground. It keeps the bottom dry." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have thought of that," he said. "Now you have," she said. He went. Reverend Aldous Price arrived on the evening of the second day. He came on foot through the snow, hat in his hands before he even reached the entrance, and Nell knew before he spoke that this was different from the first two. His face had something in it that wasn't embarrassment. It was plain fear. "My wife is coughing," he said. "I can't get the church stove to hold." "I don't know." He stopped, tried again. "I don't know what to do." Nell wrapped 2 blankets. She banked the stove in the cave and put on her coat and went down with him through the snow. She sat with the Reverend's wife through the night, doing the things she had learned in the weeks. She had sat beside James, and the things her father had taught her about the cold that works through the lungs. Warm compresses, slow heat, patience without panic. By morning the coughing had eased. She climbed back up the slope in the gray early light. She fed the stove. She wound the watch. She wrote in the ledger. Outside, -27. Inside, 44. Fire out 6 hours. She sat with her coffee in both hands and looked at the thermometer and at the ledger and at the entrance, holding its shape against the wind the same way it had held it every night for the past 6 weeks. She thought, 3 down, 1 to go. She was wrong about the order. At 2 in the morning, the knock came the same way it had come in the cold open of this story, hard without hesitation, from a man who had already made his decision on the ride over. She knew the sound of it before she reached the vestibule. She knew who it was. She had thought in the weeks since the church gathering that there would be a moment of reckoning with Caleb Cross. Some accounting. Some conversation in which the things that had been said in public were addressed in private. She had been waiting for it without quite knowing she was waiting. This was not that moment. This was simpler and more important than that. He was standing at the cave entrance with frost on his coat and nothing in his face but Ruth. Just Ruth. The way a father's face goes when there is nothing else in the world that matters. "She's been calling your name," he said. "For an hour, won't stop." She already had her bag. "How high?" she said. 103 when I left. That was 40 minutes ago. Cedar Ridge was 1.5 miles north. -27 degrees. She was dressed and threw the vestibule canvas before he finished the sentence. Cedar Ridge sat 1.5 miles north of the cave, on the flat bench of land where the valley widened before the creek turned east. Nell had ridden past it a dozen times in 3 years and never been inside the gate. She went through it now at 2:30 in the morning, behind Caleb's horse, the temperature somewhere below what the thermometer in her coat pocket was built to measure, and the stars overhead so bright and hard in the cold sky that they looked like something driven into the dark with a hammer. The house was low and long, solid timber, 4 years old. A lamp burned in the east window. She went through the door and followed Caleb down the hallway to the back bedroom, and she knew before she crossed the threshold what she was walking into. That particular thickness in the air, the smell of fever sweat, the small, shallow breathing that means a body has been working too hard for too long. Ruth was in the center of the bed, the blankets thrown back because she was burning. Her hair was dark with sweat at the temples. Her eyes, when they opened, took a moment to find Nell's face, and when they did, something in them loosened. "You came," Ruth said. "I came," Nell said. She set her bag on the bedside table. She touched Ruth's forehead with the back of her hand, then her neck, then the inside of her wrist. She looked at Caleb. "How long has it been climbing? Since yesterday noon. Did she eat today?" "A little in the afternoon." Nell nodded. She opened her bag. The things her father had taught her about fever were not complicated. They were specific. There was a difference between a fever burning something out and a fever burning the child, and you learned to read the difference in the skin, in the breathing, in the small sounds the body made when it was working versus when it was losing ground. Nell's hands knew things her mind hadn't had to think through in a while, but they found the knowledge without being asked. She worked through the cool of the night. Wool wraps at the feet to draw heat down and away from the head. Cool water, not cold, not ice. Cool at the wrists and throat at the right intervals. She kept the room at an even temperature, not too hot, and she kept Ruth's blankets light, and she sat at the side of the bed and listened. Caleb stayed in the doorway for the first hour, and then, when she did not need him for anything, went to the kitchen and put the coffee on. He brought her a cup without being asked. She drank it without looking away from Ruth. He leaned against the door frame and watched and said nothing, and she understood that this was him at his most useful, present, quiet, out of the way of the work. Around 4 in the morning, Ruth's breathing changed, deepened, steadied into something slower and more even. Nell let out a breath of her own. "Sleep," she said to Caleb. "I'll stay." He looked at his daughter. "I'll stay," Nell said again, more firmly. He went. She sat beside Ruth until the first gray showed in the window, and then she slept in the chair with her chin on her chest and her bag at her feet, the way she had learned to sleep through the weeks she had sat beside James. Not gone, not fully present, the part of her that mattered still listening, even in the dark. The second day the fever broke back and came forward again, the way it always does when it's losing. 2 steps toward the door and 1 step back. Nell managed it. She sent Thomas to the cave for the rest of the wool from her bag. She made a thin broth in the kitchen and got most of it into Ruth by noon. The third day, the fever went and stayed gone. The fourth morning, Ruth opened her eyes with the clear, deliberate focus of a person who has been away somewhere and has found their way back. She looked at the window. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at Nell, who was sitting in the chair with the ledger open in her lap, recording temperatures she had been tracking every 4 hours. "I'm hungry," Ruth said. Nell closed the ledger. "I know," she said. "That's a good sign." She made bread. She made it in the kitchen of Cedar Ridge for the first time, finding the flour and the salt without asking, because Thomas showed her where things were, and she let Ruth sit up in bed with a piece of it still warm and watch her eat without worrying for the first time in 4 days. It was that afternoon, while Nell was cleaning the bread bowl and Ruth was sleeping again with the good sleep of a body recovering, that she heard hooves in the yard. She dried her hands. She went to the front window. Dorothea Hensley's horse was tied at the gate. Dorothea was walking up the path, straight-backed in her traveling coat, the same good posture, the same measured pace. She came to the door and knocked. Nell opened it. Dorothea looked at her. She looked past her into the hallway, at the bread smell, at the lamp, at the ordinariness of a house where things were being managed, and a child was sleeping safely down the hall. She stood with it for a moment. "The notice is withdrawn," she said. 3 words, nothing before them, nothing after. She held Nell's gaze for one count, and then she turned and walked back down the path to her horse. Nell watched her go. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, standing in this doorway with those words hanging in the cold air. She had thought there would be more to it, some surge of something, satisfaction or relief, or the particular warmth of having been proven right in front of the person who had been most certain you were wrong. There was none of that. There was only the yard and the horse and Dorothea's straight back going through the gate, and somewhere behind Nell in the house, the sound of Ruth turning over in her sleep. That was enough. That was exactly enough. The following morning the notice was gone from the county land office records. Nell did not go to look. She knew because Silas Ford told her when he brought the last of the returned firewood up the slope, neat and split and stacked on her sled. More than she'd lent him. "Figured I'd give back more than I took," he said. "That's not necessary," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's right, she took the wood." She put it on the rack. It was Thomas who found the watch. Not Thomas, Ruth. Ruth was allowed out of bed on the 5th day, wrapped in 2 blankets and moved to the kitchen chair closest to the stove. And she was sitting there on the afternoon. Nell came back from the cave with the last of her kit. Nell set the bag on the table and unclipped the side pocket to put the watch back in its usual place. And in that moment, the pocket open, the watch in her hand, Ruth's arm came out from under the blanket. "What is that?" Nell set it on the table. "A watch." Ruth reached for it with both hands, the careful, deliberate reach of a child who has learned that some things are handled and some things are held. She turned it over. She looked at the face. "Why does it say 6? Nell sat down across from her. "It stopped," she said, "a long time ago." "Why doesn't it go?" Nell was quiet for a moment. "It belonged to my husband," she said. "He wound it every morning. When he died, it stopped. And I wind it every morning still, but it stopped at 6:03, and that's where it stays." Ruth looked at the face of the watch for a long time. She had the total unself-conscious gravity of a 4-year-old considering something that matters. "The 6 is lonesome," she said. Nell sat very still. She heard a sound in the doorway behind her. She did not turn around. She knew what she would find. She had heard him come in from the barn while Ruth was talking, had heard his boots in the hallway, going quiet, and then nothing. She knew he had heard. She heard him cross the room. He did not put his hand on her shoulder or her arm. He came to the table and he set his hand down on the surface beside the watch, close but not touching it, and for a moment that was everything. His hand beside the watch on the table between her and his daughter. He said, "Let me stay." She looked at his hand. The rough knuckles, the new scar across the base of the thumb from the wire fence last month that he hadn't mentioned and she'd seen. "Not through the spring," he said. "I don't mean that. I mean for always. I mean the north fence post, and every fence post after it, and whatever else needs doing for as long as there's anything left to do." He said it the way he said most things, plain and once without dressing it. "I mean, I would like your watch to not be the only sound in that cave in the morning." She looked at Ruth, who was watching both of them with the serene attention of a child who has understood more than anyone gave her credit for. She set her hand down beside Caleb's on the table, not on top of it, beside it, the way you set something down next to something else when both of them belong in the same place. "The coffee's already on," she said. He turned his hand over and covered hers once briefly, and then they both looked at Ruth, who was looking at the watch. "Is it still lonesome?" Caleb asked her. Ruth considered. She held the watch up to the window light and looked at the face with the same judicious gravity she had brought to everything since she could walk. "Not right now," she said. She set it down on the table between the two of them, not to one side, not to the other. In the middle, where it could belong to both or neither, and she patted it once with her small palm, the way you settle something into its right place. Thomas appeared in the doorway. He had been in the barn. He looked at his father's hand and at Nell's hand and at the watch between them, and he stood there for a moment with the careful, reading expression he always had when he was deciding how he felt about something. Then he said, "I'll get the coffee." He was 8 years old. He had never made coffee in his life. What came out of the pot 15 minutes later was closer to hot brown water than anything a man would put in a cup, and neither Nell nor Caleb said a word about it. They drank every drop. They were married in the spring on a Thursday afternoon, with the creek running loud from the snowmelt and the pines putting out their new color on the ridge above. Reverend Aldous Price performed the service in the church without mentioning Cheyenne or anything connected to it. Thomas stood to the left of Caleb in a coat that had been let out at the shoulders. Ruth stood to the right of Nell in a dress that Marta had sewn from blue wool and stayed remarkably still for approximately 4 minutes before sitting down on the floor to look at something near the baseboard that no one else could see. Marta sat in the front pew with her hands folded and her eyes bright. The reception was bread and coffee and 2 pies that Cora Phelps brought without being asked. Silas Ford fixed the hinge on the church's north door while everyone was eating, because it had been squeaking since October and it bothered him. Nobody made speeches. Dorothea Hensley did not attend the wedding. She sent through her husband's office a formal letter acknowledging the resolution of the homestead matter and wishing Eleanor Wade continued success in her claim. It was the longest 3 sentences Nell had ever received from her. She read them once. She put the letter in the chest where she kept James's things. It seemed like the right place for something that had arrived too late to matter and mattered anyway. It was a small wedding. It was the right size. Spring moved into summer and summer into the next autumn, and the rhythm of Pine Hollow settled back into itself the way it always did after a hard winter, with a particular gratitude for ordinary things, for wood that burns cleanly, and water that doesn't freeze, and walls that hold their warmth. People made changes quietly, without announcing them. Raised wood racks appeared at several properties. A new vestibule went up at the Reverend's house before the following December. No one called these things cave ideas. They were just things that worked. The cave stayed. Nell had been right about its uses, and she went on being right in the ways that mattered. In summer it kept roots and dried goods cool. In shoulder seasons it served as a storage room and a thinking space, and on one notable occasion a temporary home for 3 of Caleb's horses when the barn roof took on water. In deep winter it was still the warmest room any of them knew, and they used it accordingly, and every year Nell updated the ledger and made the necessary repairs, the leather strip at the curtain base, the stovepipe cap, the drainage channel cleared of the autumn's debris. One stone, then the next. She wound the watch every morning at 6 o'clock. On an October morning, the 2nd autumn of their marriage, she stood at the cave mouth in the early light. The valley below was putting on its autumn color, the last yellow of the cottonwoods along the creek, the dark green of the pines above. 3 pairs of boots sat at the vestibule entrance. Hers, Caleb's, Ruth's small pair that she grew out of regularly and replaced without complaint. From inside came the sound of the stove and the smell of the coffee, and the low particular noise of a household that is inhabited and warm. Thomas's voice saying something to his father. Ruth's answer, which was not to the question Thomas had asked, but which seemed to satisfy her entirely. The ordinary sounds of a morning that had somewhere in it become ordinary, which is to say, had become hers. Nell looked at the stake she had driven into the ground 2 years ago, when Dorothea Hensley had watched from the road below and said someone ought to send for the doctor. Beside it, set deep into the ground 6 inches from the original, was a fence post, straight, true, new wood going gray at the top. Caleb had put it in the week after the wedding. He hadn't said anything about it. He'd just put it there. She wound the watch, 6:03. The hands did not move. She put it back in her pocket. The mountain said nothing. It never had. This morning that suited her just fine. The cold does not ask who was right. It only asks who was ready. Eleanor Wade had been ready for a long time, longer than anyone in Pine Hollow had thought to notice, longer than she had been given credit for, longer than the notices and the sorrowful looks and the church hall had been able to touch. She had built it 1 stone at a time, in the cold, alone, and then not alone, and then not alone in a way that had nothing to do with cave walls or wool curtains or what the thermometer read at dawn. She picked up her hammer. There was a section of the entrance frame that needed a new lashing before the first hard freeze. 1 stone, then the next.